He told his valet she'd begged to come home by winter. He was wrong about that. He was also wrong to make the demand that drove her away, and by the time he admits it, his valet is managing her household, reading his letters, and quietly engineering the reconciliation he's too proud to ask for. This is the slowest, most satisfying revenge a borrowed servant ever took on the man who lost him. The lane to Calder Heath was exactly as Sylvie remembered it. Narrow, hedged on both sides by something brown and skeletal, and deeply unimpressed by its own existence. The carriage listed slightly to the left where the ruts deepened, and the sky above Wiltshire was the particular shade of grey that English skies reserved for homecomings they considered unwise. Sylvie had been away 8 months. The house, when it came into view around the final bend, looked as though it had been waiting with its arms crossed. It was not a bad house. Her father had liked it, which counted for something, and it had good bones beneath the ivy and the general air of mild reproach. 2 stories, 6 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced north, a sitting room with a window that looked onto the lane. Her father had used that room for reading. Her mother had used it for watching the road when he was late home from London. Sylvie had used it as a child for both. She was not a child now. "The chimney in the east wing will want looking at," said Edmund Crale from the opposite seat, without looking up from the household ledger he had been annotating since Marlborough. "The surveyor's note is from March. 7 months of Wiltshire weather, and a blocked flue is a chimney fire by Christmas." "Note it on the list," she said. "It is on the list. It has been on the list since Lion. I have also noted the sitting-room window. There is a crack in the upper pane from the surveyor's report, and the left frame is soft where water has got in. The glazier in Marlborough can see to both. He should be engaged before November, or his diary will be full." "It is October." 4 weeks to November," Edmund said. "I can write to him today." Sylvie looked at him. He had the ledger open across one knee and a pencil behind one ear, and the expression of a man who considered the emotional dimensions of homecoming to be adequately handled by someone else. In 8 months of his company, she had not once seen him flustered, which was either a great comfort or a significant personal failing in him. She had not yet decided which. "Write to him," she said. He made a note. The carriage drew up before the front door. Sylvie's maid, Pane, French, 19, deeply suspicious of England on principle, pressed her nose briefly to the window glass and then withdrew it as though the view had confirmed her worst expectations. "It is very grey," she said. "It is October," Sylvie said. "In Lion, October is gold." "In Lion," Edmund said pleasantly, "it is also considerably further from London, which is the relevant point." Pane gave him the look she reserved for people who were technically correct. They descended. The house received them in the manner of a place that had been shut for 8 months, cool, slightly stale, and full of furniture draped in holland covers that made every room look like a gathering of unhappy ghosts. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenn, compact, capable, 50 and loyal in the way of someone who has served the dead long enough to know how to serve the living, received them at the door. "Welcome home, Miss Calder. The east chimney—" "Mr. Crale has told me." Mrs. Fenn gave Edmund a brief approving look. He received it without expression. The covers came off. The fires were lit, all but the east bedroom. Edmund walked the house with Mrs. Fenn and the ledger and returned with 4 additions to the list, which he presented to Sylvie over the first dinner with the air of a man delivering mildly interesting news. "The larder wants restocking. The garden has gone to seed on the south side. The undergardener left in August. The library has damp in the far corner, and the glazier should come as soon as he is available. The window frame will need replacing within the year, or the whole casement will go." Sylvie looked at the list. "Is there anything that does not want immediate attention?" Edmund considered this with apparent sincerity. "The front door," he said. "The hinges are sound." High praise. "I find it is wise to identify what works before cataloguing what doesn't." She dismissed him and ate her dinner alone, which was the correct and proper thing to do, and which felt in the large and slightly damp dining room extremely quiet. The letter from the Duke of Calmore arrived on the 4th day. Sylvie knew it was from him before she opened it, from the weight of the paper, and from the handwriting on the direction, angular and controlled, the hand of a man trying to appear unhurried. Edmund brought it in on the small silver tray that had been her father's, and set it beside her breakfast plate with the neutrality of a man delivering correspondence of no particular consequence. She broke the seal, a rampant stag, which had always struck her as an animal selected by someone who had never actually encountered one. "Dear Miss Calder," it began, "not my dear Sylvie." The formality of it sat on the page like a cleared throat. It ran to a page and a half and said, in essence, he was aware she had returned, he hoped she was well. He was in the county for the month at Calmore Park, and he remained sincerely hers, Dominic Calmore. There was no mention of the engagement, no mention of the demand, no mention of the Valencourts whose names had been the beginning and end of everything. She set it down. She became aware, some moments later, that she was standing at the sitting-room window looking out at the lane. The glass was cold under her fingertips. The crack in the upper pane was clearly visible, a thin diagonal line from corner to centre, and the draught, while not yet significant, was real. Edmund appeared at her elbow and set a cup of tea on the small table beside the window. "I did not ask for tea," she said. "No," he said. He left. She drank it. She did not reply. She wrote to her solicitor in Salisbury, a longer letter to Uncle Philippe Valancourt in Lyon, and a note to the chimney sweep. The Duke's letter she placed in the right-hand drawer of her father's desk, where she put things she had not decided what to do with. Edmund, observing the desk over the following days with the peripheral attention he gave to most things in the house, noted that the drawer was opened twice and not added to. He said nothing about this. 3 weeks passed. October exhausted itself and became November in the way that English months did, without announcement, with only the evidence of darker mornings and a cold that had moved from outdoors to indoors. Sylvie attended Sunday service at the parish church and was observed doing so by approximately everyone present. The rector shook her hand with both of his and said he was very glad to have her back and that her father had been a fine man. "He was," Sylvie said. She meant it without complication, which was the cleanest grief she had managed in a year. Edmund accompanied her on most of these excursions in the capacity of her most senior male servant, an elevated interpretation of his role, but accurate enough that no one questioned it. He carried things, managed the carriage arrangements, and said very little in public, which Sylvie had come to understand did not indicate inattention. He missed nothing. He simply kept it until it was useful. It was on the return from Sunday service one morning in early November, inside the carriage, that she said, "Did the Duke of Calmore ever speak of Wiltshire, when you were in his service?" Edmund was on the box. The question had to travel through the small hatch. A pause. "He spoke of Calmore Park with some frequency. He considers it better than Wiltshire generally deserves." "That sounds like him. He spoke of Calder Heath once. He asked me if I knew it." Sylvie went still. "And what did you say?" "That I did not at the time. He did not pursue it." "No," she said. "He rarely pursues what he expects to come to him." Edmund did not reply. The carriage went over a rut. The lane narrowed and then widened, and then Calder Heath came around the bend with its arms still crossed, and Sylvie went in and stood at the sitting-room window until the light went. The glazier came the second week of November and repaired the crack. He also confirmed the frame was soft on the left side and would want replacing in spring. Sylvie stood in the sitting-room doorway while he delivered this assessment, feeling that the house was making a sustained argument she had not yet found the counterpoint to. Edmund had the bill ready. She signed it. The window, once repaired, let the afternoon light in, fractionally brighter at the edges. The lane outside was the same lane. She had stood at this window as a girl watching for her father's carriage. She had stood at it as a young woman of 19, just engaged, watching Dominic's curricle disappear down the lane after the first visit he had paid as her intended, and she had thought she was beginning something she understood. She had been wrong about that. She did not reply to the Duke's letter. This was not a decision so much as a continued suspension of one, which was how Sylvie had found herself managing most things since the engagement ended. Decisions required a settled position from which to act, and her position, if she was honest, was not settled. It was a house with a soft window frame and a recently repaired chimney, which was a metaphor she refused to develop. The household was something she could act on. She worked through the accounts with Edmund on Monday mornings, the library table cleared of everything except ledgers, the brazier burning at the damp corner. They fell into a working rhythm that involved more conversation than was strictly necessary. Edmund knew things about Calmore, small observed things, and occasionally let one slip by what she suspected was calculated accident. Her English aunt arrived in the second week of November. Mrs. Dorothea Calder, her father's sister, unmarried, 61, compact as a wren and twice as sharp, descended from her carriage with the air of a woman arriving to assess structural damage after a storm. She kissed Sylvie on the cheek, walked through the ground-floor rooms making sounds of moderate approval, and arrived in the library where Edmund was mid-sentence about the South Field. She looked at him. He looked at the ledger. "Who is this?" she said. "Edmund Crale. He manages the household." Dorothea absorbed this. "Carry on," she said, and took the chair by the window. She stayed a fortnight. She was genuinely useful. She knew everyone in Wiltshire and was known by them, and her presence at Sylvie's side on calls recalibrated the neighbourhood's collective assessment of the situation. Sylvie Calder, the diplomat's daughter, living quietly with her aunt, was a considerably more manageable narrative than that French girl who fled the county. This was, Dorothea made clear, entirely intentional. "You are not French," Dorothea said on the third evening over the fire in the sitting room. "My mother was." "Your mother was Genevieve Valet, who married an Englishman and made a life. You are the same. Half of one thing and half of another is still a whole." Sylvie looked at the window. "Calmore did not think so." "Calmore is an idiot," Dorothea said pleasantly. "He has also said nothing against you. Not a word in a county that expected him to. I do not say this to excuse him. I say it because you ought to have accurate information." Sylvie absorbed this. "He wrote to me." "I know, I saw the drawer." A pause. "I am not in the habit of reading other people's correspondence. I am, however, in the habit of noticing that a drawer opened frequently and never added to suggests the presence of something already in it." "You are very observant." "I have been observant for 61 years. It is the only dependable amusement available." Dorothea drew a thread through her linen. "What did he say?" "Nothing precisely, and everything somewhat." "Ah," said Dorothea, and went back to her embroidery and did not push. It was Edmund who told her without meaning to about the pheasant. Not in so many words. 2 days after Dorothea's remark, while reviewing winter provisions, Sylvie asked whether he had encountered the Duke much during his 6 months in the Calmore household. "Sufficiently," Edmund said. "What does that mean?" He set the list down. "It means enough to form an opinion and not enough to be certain of it." "What is your opinion?" A pause. "He is a man more comfortable with certainty than doubt. When he is uncertain, he behaves as if he is not, which creates the impression of arrogance. Whether it is arrogance or anxiety in disguise, I am not positioned to say." Sylvie stared at him. "The pheasant," Edmund continued, picking up the list again, "can be managed through February if Mrs. Fenn is conservative." "Edmund." He looked up. "That was considerably more interesting than you were required to offer. You asked for my opinion." "I asked if you had encountered him much." "That is my opinion of my encounters with him." She studied him. He had managed her uncle's house in Lyon for 2 years before she arrived, an establishment of 11 people on a budget her uncle revised downward each quarter, while revising his enthusiasm for guests upward. He had kept it running, with a combination of creative accounting and social management that Sylvie had initially taken for sorcery. "You liked him," she said. "The Duke." Edmund's expression arranged itself into something non-committal. "I found him adequately tolerable, in the way that one finds adequate tolerability in a household that is well run and not unkind." "He was not unkind to the staff?" "He was not unkind to anyone within his household." She understood what he was not saying. "Only to those outside it." Edmund returned to the list. Dorothea left at the end of November, with the promise of returning for Christmas, an arrival that would include a Mrs. Holt, a Colonel Festing, and her young cousin Arthur, who was down from Oxford and needed somewhere to be pointed. The house was quieter without her. Sylvie took to working in the sitting room in the afternoons, her writing table near the window that faced the lane. Edmund brought tea without being asked, and she had long since stopped commenting on this, which perhaps amounted to an endorsement. "The accounts for November are complete," he said one such afternoon, "and the glazier has confirmed the spring date for the window frame." She looked at the window. The light came through it cleanly now, the crack gone, the glass fractionally brighter, but the frame still bowed slightly at the left where the water had got in. "You think of everything in advance," she said. "It is easier than managing crises after the fact." "My uncle said the same. He said you had saved him the cost of 3 emergencies in 2 years by preventing them." Edmund said nothing. "He was very sorry to give you up," she said. "He has Remy now. Remy is capable. He is 22 and has never managed a household larger than 4 rooms. He will learn. A small pause. Your uncle is patient. He is. She looked at the window. He asks after you in his letters. He writes it in French, so I will think he is not making a point about where your proper place is. My proper place is wherever I am doing useful work. She looked at him then, and he looked back, and there was a moment where neither of them was pretending the conversation was about the glazier's schedule. Then she picked up her book. Tea, she said, thank you. He left. She did not read the book. Arthur Calder arrived a week before Christmas, with 2 trunks, a retriever of uncertain temperament named Copernicus, and the immediate opinion that Calder Heath was a capital sort of house. It's cold, Sylvie said. Yes, capital, isn't it? Said Arthur. Very honest about itself. He was 20, fair-haired, and possessed of the cheerful social incompetence exclusive to young men who have been comfortable in their own homes and are now discovering the rest of the world requires management. But he was genuinely curious about things. He spent his first afternoon asking Edmund about land drainage, and his first evening asking Sylvie questions she found, despite herself, worth answering. What's this about Calmore being in the county? He said on the second evening in the sitting room. The room was very quiet for a moment. He is at Calmore Park, Sylvie said, in the north of the county. I know where Calmore Park is. I heard he'd been about. He wrote to me. Arthur absorbed this with more sensitivity than she'd credited him. He did not push. Right, he said, rotten luck. It was not rotten, it was a letter. Still, a pause. He's an idiot, you know. Well, some people say he was in the right and you were... He stopped. I mean to say some people are also idiots. Arthur. Yes? You may stop. Stopping, he said, and reached for his tea. Christmas arrived with Dorothea, Mrs. Holt, Colonel Festing, and enough cold weather to justify the firewood expenditure Edmund had been quietly advocating since October. Calder Heath, with fires in the ground-floor rooms and the smell of evergreen boughs and Mrs. Fenn's mince pies, became warm in the way a house achieves when it is properly inhabited, not architecturally, but in the sense that mattered. Edmund managed all of it with the invisibility of very good household work. Everyone was comfortable, everything appeared, nothing ran out, and no one except Sylvie saw quite how it was done. She saw because she watched. She did not examine why she watched. On Christmas evening, after the guests retired, she was alone in the sitting room with the last of the fire and a glass of her father's Madeira. Edmund came to bank the coals. It was a good Christmas, she said. He straightened, looked around the room, the evergreens, the burned-down candles, the chairs in post-party disorder. It was, he said. You managed it beautifully. Mrs. Fenn managed the kitchen beautifully. I managed the schedule. The schedule was the hard part. The schedule is always the hard part. She looked at the window. Dark now, only the reflection of the fire, the bowed left frame visible even in that. How long were you with him, she said. At Calmore Park. 6 months and some days. He never spoke of me, directly. A pause. He spoke of you as one speaks of a subject that is present in the room but not acknowledged. Give me the honest version. Edmund looked at the coals. Once I brought his correspondence in the morning, and there was a letter returned, one he had sent to you in France, addressed to the Valencourt house, unread, the seal unbroken. He paused. He put it in the fire. He asked for his coat and went out. Sylvie was very still. I did not know, she said, about that letter. No, I did not think you did. She turned to the window. The fire was dying behind her. The reflection faded. Thank you, she said. Good night, Miss Calder. He banked the coals and left, and she stood at the dark window long after the room had gone cold, thinking about a letter put into a fire by a man who had not said a word. 3 days after Christmas, on the 28th of December, the Duke of Calmore called at Calder Heath without warning. This was an act of social boldness, occupying a precise point between daring and impertinence, and close enough to the impertinent end that Sylvie's first response, on being informed by Mrs. Fenn that His Grace's carriage was in the lane, was to set down her embroidery and look at the ceiling. He has not been invited, she said. No, Miss Calder. And he is simply there. At the door, Miss Calder. Sylvie looked at the sitting-room window, the lane, the rear quarter of a very good carriage, the evidence that Dominic Calmore had driven from Calmore Park on a morning when the frost had not fully lifted, and knocked on her door with full knowledge of what he was doing. "Is my aunt still at breakfast?" she said. "Mrs. Calder is in the morning room, Miss Calder. Ask her to join us in the sitting room in 10 minutes. She stood. Who received him? "Mr. Crale, Miss Calder." She nearly smiled and prevented herself. Very well. Edmund was standing where he should be, to the side of the entrance hall, available without being intrusive. His face gave nothing away. It never gave anything away, which was either a professional requirement or a constitutional disposition, and she had decided some weeks ago that it was both. Dominic stood in the center of the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, and the appearance of a man who was slightly uncertain what to do next. Good, she thought, and then immediately reprimanded herself. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Calder." He inclined his head. "I apologize for calling without notice. I had intended to write first. I found I could not wait for the post." "That is very direct of you." "I am attempting directness. I understand it is considered a virtue in some quarters." She recognized the echo of his own letter thrown back at him. He recognized it too. A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth. "Will you come in?" she said. "If you'll permit it." She led him to the sitting room. Edmund materialized in the doorway a moment later. "Tea, Miss Calder?" "Please, and ask Mrs. Calder if she will join us." Edmund withdrew. Dorothea would arrive in her own time, at the pace of a woman who understood her purpose precisely and saw no need to rush it. Sylvie and Dominic faced each other across the small room. The fire was burning. The window was behind her. "You received my letter," he said. "I did." "And you did not reply." "I did not." "May I ask why?" "Because I was not certain what to say, and I will not write letters I am not certain of." He absorbed this. "That is fair." A silence. The fire shifted. "I meant what I wrote," he said, "that I did not know how to be wrong." "It sounds honest," she said. "It is also insufficient." "Yes," he said, "I know." "You made a demand." "I did." "And when I did not comply, you expected—" "I expected you would come back," he said. "By winter." His jaw tightened slightly. "I was wrong about that as well." She looked at him steadily. "What changed?" "You left." He said it simply. "I had been certain you would not. When you did, I had to account for why." "And your accounting?" "That I asked you to be less than yourself, and that you were sensible enough not to agree to it." The door opened. Dorothea entered with her embroidery, and her excellent timing said, "Good morning, Your Grace," with the warmth of a woman who had decided to be pleasant and the precision of one who had decided to be brief, and settled herself in the chair nearest the door. The room rearranged itself accordingly. Edmund entered with the tray. He set it on the low table and moved to withdraw. Dominic's eyes tracked him briefly, not unkindly, but with the adjustment of a man encountering a situation he had not fully anticipated. "Crale," he said. Edmund paused at the door. "Your Grace." "You are well?" "Very well, thank you." "Good," he said. "I am glad of it." Edmund withdrew. Sylvie poured. She handed him a cup. Their fingers did not touch. Everything about the exchange was precisely correct and entirely too deliberate. "The Valancourts," Dominic said. Sylvie went still. "I should not have asked you to break with them. I knew what they meant to you. I knew, and I believed the life I was offering would compensate for what I was asking you to give up." He stopped. "I have told you this in the letter. I say it now because it requires saying in a room." She set her cup down. "What changed your mind in 8 months?" "You left, and I had no one to argue with about whether I was right." A pause. "It is easier to be certain in company." Dorothea, who had not looked up from her embroidery, made a small sound that could have been agreement. Sylvie looked at the window. "I don't know what I want from this conversation. I want you to understand that clearly." "I understand it. I am not here to make this easy." "I would not ask you to." They sat. The fire, the tea, the window with its pale December light. "After a moment, your aunt is here for Christmas." "She came for Christmas. She stays through the New Year." Sylvie held his gaze. "I'm not alone." He received the subtext without comment. "Of course. And my cousin Arthur is in the far field. I saw a dog in the lane." "Arthur chose the name." The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course he did." She almost nearly smiled. "Are you in the county long?" she said. "Until after the New Year, possibly longer." He looked at her. "I have no pressing reason to return to London." "You may call," she said at last, "properly, when invited." He looked at her with something steadier than gratitude and quieter than relief. "Thank you," he said. They finished the tea. Dorothea finished a row of stitching and set her embroidery down. He stood to leave. Sylvie walked him to the entrance hall. Edmund appeared from the kitchen passage with the Duke's coat, with the timing of a man who had been positioned nearby with purpose. He helped Dominic into his coat. Dominic accepted this with the equilibrium of a man in the presence of someone who used to be in his service and is now in another's. Not awkward, not overcompensating. "You have a good household here," Dominic said to Sylvie at the door. "Yes," she said, "I do." He looked briefly at Edmund. Edmund was looking at the door. "Good day, Miss Calder." "Good day, Your Grace." He went, the door closed. Sylvie looked at Edmund. "You were in the passage." "I was near the passage. For some time. I had business near the passage." She looked at him for a long moment. "What did you make of it?" Edmund considered. A man who sends letters and waits for replies is managing his approach. A man who drives in the frost is not managing anything. He paused. It may be significant, or it may simply be that he is impatient. "He has always been impatient." "Yes, but previously he was impatient for things to arrive at him. Today he was impatient to be present." "That is a distinction," she said. "It seemed worth noting." "Note it," she said, "and do not mention it again until I ask." "Of course, Miss Calder." She turned toward the sitting room, paused. "He spoke of my uncle just now, and at the Vines dinner you told me he asked after the Valancourts." "Yes." "Did he ever ask after them when he was in his own service?" The pause was brief. "Not to me directly, but on one occasion his secretary asked me to locate a French grammar that had been ordered from a bookseller and had not arrived. He straightened a coat on the hall stand that did not need straightening. A beginning primer. I assumed it was for general purposes." Sylvie stared at him. He was learning French. "That seems a reasonable inference." "Before you came to France." "The order predated my arrival by some months, based on what the secretary told me." She was very still. She turned away, took 2 steps, stopped. "He was learning French," she said again to the wall. "So it appears," Edmund said, and went back to his business near the passage. Dorothea, when Sylvie returned to the sitting room, was at the window looking out at the lane. "Well," she said without turning, "he is taller than I remembered." "You have met him before?" "At your engagement dinner. You were so luminous that evening that no one looked at him." She turned. "I looked at him. Men are informative when no one is attending to them." "And what did you conclude?" "That he was proud and uncomfortable in his pride, which is the worst variety." She resumed her chair. "He was less uncomfortable today." Sylvie sat. She looked at the window. The carriage was gone from the lane. The frost tracks were already fading in the pale December sun. "He ordered a French grammar," she said. "Before I left, Edmund found out." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "Did he learn it?" "I don't know." "Perhaps," Dorothea said, "you should find out." She picked up her embroidery. Sylvie looked at the window until Arthur returned with Copernicus and wind-brightened cheeks and asked cheerfully whether that had been Calmore's carriage in the lane, because he was fairly sure he'd seen wheel tracks in the frost. "It was," Sylvie said from the window. "How did it go?" "Come in and close the door," said Sylvie. He came in. He closed the door. Copernicus put his head on Arthur's knee. Dorothea did not look up from her embroidery. "He was learning French," Sylvie said. Arthur blinked. Then carefully, "Well," he said, "that is a thing." "Yes," said Sylvie. She turned from the window. "It is rather a thing." The fire settled. Outside the frost was gone from the hedges and the lane was clear, and the window, the fixed, reglazed, still slightly bowed window, held the pale light of a December day in England, exactly as it always had. She wrote on the 31st of December. Not immediately after the visit. Not in the flush of the French grammar revelation, which would have been the wrong reason to write, or at least an insufficient one. She waited 3 days. 3 days in which she finished the novel she had been using as an elbow rest, walked the South Field with Edmund to inspect the drainage situation in person, and had one long conversation with Arthur about whether a man who orders a French grammar in secret is more or less honest than one who announces the effort. "More," Arthur said immediately. "Obviously, he wasn't performing it." He might have been performing it for himself, constructing a private narrative of good intention. That's a very uncharitable interpretation. I am practicing being charitable, Sylvie said. I find I need the practice. Arthur looked at her with the expression of a young man trying to decide if he was being made fun of. He was not. She wrote on the 31st. The letter was brief, half a page, and said that she would be glad to receive him if he cared to call again, and that Mrs. Fenn made excellent seed cake on Thursdays, which she mentioned for no particular reason. She signed it Sylvie Calder and gave it to Edmund for the post without reading it back. "The post goes at 3, Edmund said. "I know." He went. She stood at the sitting-room window and watched the lane as though she could observe the letter travelling northward toward Calmore Park, which she could not, but the instinct was the same one that had stood her at this window in various weathers for most of her life, watching the road for things that had not yet arrived. The reply came on the 2nd of January. He had clearly written back the same day hers arrived, possibly the same hour. "Dear Miss Calder, Thursday, if it suits. Yours, Dominic Calmore. Perhaps I'm glad of the seed cake." She read it twice. Then she took it to Edmund, who was in the kitchen passage reviewing the linen inventory with Mrs. Fenn, and held it out. "He's coming Thursday," she said. Edmund looked at the letter, at Sylvie, at Mrs. Fenn. "Then we shall want seed cake," he said. Mrs. Fenn, who had been at Calder Heath long enough to recognize the shape of events without being told the contents, went back to the linen with the satisfied expression of a woman whose Thursday baking schedule had just become significant. Thursday arrived with better weather than December had managed. The frost still present in the mornings, but a cleaner, brighter cold that had the quality of January rather than December's grey persistence. Arthur, who had extended his stay without anyone quite asking him to and without anyone quite asking him to leave, took Copernicus out immediately after breakfast on the grounds that the dog needed the exercise, which was true, and remained out for most of the morning, which was useful. Dorothea had departed the day prior, having stayed through the new year with the satisfaction of a woman whose arrangements were proceeding correctly. Her absence left the house quieter and the proprieties somewhat thinner, a situation she had addressed before leaving by instructing Mrs. Fenn that she was to consider herself at liberty to be present in whatever room Miss Calder required her, without being asked on days when His Grace called. Mrs. Fenn received this instruction with the gravity of a woman who had been managing proprieties for 30 years, and needed no explanation of their purpose. Dominic arrived at 11. He arrived in the carriage this time, not the curricle, the step up in formality, the acknowledgement that this was a proper call, a thing being conducted correctly. Edmund received him at the door. Sylvie heard their voices from the sitting-room, brief and low, the ordinary commerce of arrival. When Dominic came into the sitting-room, he was without his hat and coat, and he looked, in the plain light of a January morning, like a man who was attempting very carefully not to attempt anything. "Miss Calder." "Your Grace, please sit." He sat. She sat. The fire was between them and the window behind her. Mrs. Fenn moved quietly in the passage outside, present enough to satisfy convention without intruding on conversation. Edmund brought tea and seed cake and withdrew, leaving the door at its 3 inches of propriety. "You have a good view of the lane from that window," Dominic said. "Yes. My mother used to say it was the best room in the house for knowing what was coming." "Is she—" He stopped. "She died 4 years ago, before my father. I'm sorry, I knew, but I am sorry. You need not be sorry for knowing. I am sorry for not asking when I should have." She looked at him. "When should you have?" "When we were engaged." He met her eyes. "I knew very little about the Valencourts. I did not ask enough. I treated the correspondence as an administrative complication rather than as what it was." "Which was?" "The primary connection you had left to your mother." The fire settled. Outside, the lane was empty. "Yes," Sylvie said, "that is what it was." He was quiet for a moment. "Valencourt is her brother?" "Her eldest brother. There are 3, Philippe, who is the eldest, Auguste, and Henri, who lives in Paris. Uncle Philippe is who I stayed with in Lyon. He and my mother were very close." A pause. "She wrote to him every week until she died. He wrote to her. I have all the letters." "All of them?" "She kept everything. She was systematic about letters." Sylvie looked at the window. "When my father died, the first person I wrote to was Uncle Philippe, before the solicitor, before the family here." She paused. "I am not sure what that tells you." "It tells me," Dominic said slowly, That I asked you to sever the connection you use when you are most in need of it. She turned from the window to look at him. Yes, she said, that is exactly what you did. He held her gaze. He did not look away and he did not qualify it. He simply received it, which was more useful than anything else he could have done. I have written to him, Dominic said. She stared. You have written to my uncle. To Monsieur Valencourt in November. A pause. The letter was not very good. My French is I am still working on it. You wrote to him in French. I attempted to. I had help with the grammar. A very brief pause. Crale was kind enough to review the final draft. She looked at the door. She looked back at him. She did not know what her face was doing and suspected it was doing several things at once. What did you say? In the letter? I said that I had behaved toward his niece in a manner that was not worthy of her, and that I wished him to know I understood this, and that if he chose not to reply, I would understand that equally. Did he reply? Dominic looked at the fire. He replied in January last week. He wrote in English, which I suspect was an act of mercy rather than preference. He said, a pause. He said that his niece had excellent judgment, and that he was content to allow events to proceed at her pace. Sylvie absorbed this. Uncle Philippe does not say anything simple when he says something like that. No, I rather thought not. He means that he is watching. I gathered. And that his approval is contingent. I gathered that as well. He is not... She stopped. He is not a man who forgives easily. When my father was ill, there was a period when Uncle Philippe was not speaking to him over a business matter, and they did not reconcile for 8 months. And my mother... She stopped again. He has forgiven you in the sense that he replied. He has not absolved you. I don't expect absolution, Dominic said. I expect to have to earn it. She looked at him for a long moment. Good, she said. He reached for his tea. She reached for hers. Their cups coincided over the low table, and they were briefly, jointly ridiculous, navigating the same small space. The seed cake, she said. Yes, I was promised seed cake. She cut him a slice. He took it. He ate it with the concentrated attention of a man who is choosing not to say anything, because everything he might say is too much. Edmund reviewed the French grammar, she said. He did. How did you come to ask him? Dominic set his plate down. He was leaving. He had given notice. He told me when he gave notice that he was entering your household, and I... He stopped. I had a letter half written to Valencourt that I had been attempting for weeks. I asked him if he would look it over before he left. It was not the most dignified request I have made. What did he say when you asked? He said he would and sat down and read it, and then looked at me and said the 3rd paragraph was too long, and the apology in the 2nd sentence was grammatically incorrect in a way that inverted its meaning. She bit her lip. What did you say? I said he was right and could he fix it. And he did. He did. Of course he did, she said. She looked at the window. At the lane, the frost, the pale, clear morning. He is very good, she said, at fixing things. Yes, Dominic said with an expression she could not fully read. I noticed. After that Thursday, he came each week. Not always Thursday. Once Tuesday, once Saturday, once Sunday, directly after church, which was bold enough to make the rector look twice. But weekly, steadily, in the way that something becomes a pattern before anyone has decided to call it one. The visits ran an hour, sometimes 2. Edmund managed the tea and the fire, and the appropriate distances with the efficiency of a man conducting a delicate logistical operation who finds the work genuinely interesting. Mrs. Fenn moved through the house on those afternoons with the attentive unobtrusiveness of a woman who understood her role precisely. Arthur, who had by January abandoned all pretense of needing to be at Oxford for anything, became the household's unofficial secondary presence, appearing in doorways at the moment when a conversation had reached its natural terminus and departing from rooms at the moment when it was about to begin. You are very strategically placed, Sylvie told him on a Tuesday. I'm walking the dog, he said. You have been walking the dog for 3 hours. Copernicus has considerable energy. Copernicus, she said, is asleep on the hall floor. Arthur looked at the dog. He looked at Sylvie. I'm giving you room, he said simply, and went to find something to read. The visits had a rhythm. They began formally and relaxed by degrees over the first half hour, the register dropping slowly like a room warming. By the second half-hour they were talking with an ease that surprised her each time, because she had been braced for the difficulty of him, and he kept not being as difficult as she expected. He asked about France, not in the polite at-one-remove way of drawing-room conversation, but specifically with attention. What Lyon was like in summer, what the Valencourt house looked like, whether Uncle Philippe's gout had responded to the cure he had been trying the previous autumn. She told him. She found she wanted to tell him. The Valencourt house was tall and narrow, with yellow shutters on the upper floors, and a garden that was mostly Uncle Philippe's ambition and only partially actualized. Lyon in summer was too warm and too loud, and the market near the river sold a kind of cheese she had been unable to find in England, and thought about with unreasonable frequency. "I could send to France," he said, "of the cheese." She looked at him. "You don't need to send to France for cheese." "I would like to," he said, and left it there, which was precisely the right place to leave it. She told him about her mother. She had not, in 8 months since the engagement ended, told anyone in England about her mother, not properly, not the particular texture of who she was, because her English acquaintances were her father's acquaintances, and her mother had been their imported complication. With Dominic she started talking about Genevieve Valencourt, who became Genevieve Calder, and found she did not stop for a while. He listened. He asked one question midway through: was she happy in England? Sylvie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "She was happy with my father," she said at last. "She was not always happy in England. Those were separate conditions." He nodded. "Yes, I understand that distinction." "Do you?" "My mother was from the north, Yorkshire. She was never entirely comfortable in London, which is where my father preferred to be. She was happy with him, and not happy in London. She managed it." He paused. "I watched her manage it." "And what did you conclude?" "At the time, nothing. In retrospect—" He stopped. "In retrospect, I concluded too recently to have acted on it." She was quiet. "I am telling you," he said carefully, "that I did not understand it until I had already made the same demand of you that London made of her. I am not offering this as an excuse. I am offering it as an explanation of how I could have been so wrong while being so certain." She looked at the window, the lane, the January light, honest about its own limitations. "That," she said at last, "is the most useful thing you have said to me." "Because?" "Because I understand that kind of certainty. I have it too." She paused. "I was certain you were only convenient. I was certain I was correct to leave. I was certain I was managing perfectly well." "Were you?" She looked at the window. "I was managing," she said. "That is not the same thing." The silence that followed was not the silence of a conversation that had run out, but the silence of two people who have arrived at something and are standing with it. Then Arthur appeared in the doorway with Copernicus and an expression of elaborate innocence. "Cold out," he said. "Anyone want tea?" The local assembly was held on the last Friday of January at the market hall in the village, 12 miles from Calder Heath, which was not far enough to excuse non-attendance if one was a young woman of the neighbourhood attempting to re-establish herself, and not near enough to be comfortable on an icy road. Sylvie went. Edmund arranged the carriage and accompanied them being Sylvie, Arthur, and, by an arrangement of coincidence that was too neat to be accidental, the Duke of Calmore, who had mentioned at Thursday's visit that he was likely to attend, and who arrived at the assembly from the North Road at almost exactly the same moment as Calder Heath's carriage arrived from the south. "Good evening," he said on the steps. "Good evening," she said. "What a coincidence." He had the grace to look slightly caught. "I may have inquired about the starting time." "Of whom?" "Your cousin. He was very forthcoming." She glanced at Arthur, who was already inside and feigning deafness. "Yes," she said, "he generally is." They went in together, which was noted, as everything was noted, by everyone present. Perhaps 60 people compressed into a hall that smelled of candles and winter wool, and the particular hope that attends provincial assemblies when the room contains a duke. They did not spend the evening together. That would have been too much, and they both understood what was too much. But they spent it in the same room, in the same company, with the peripheral awareness of each other that had become, over January, less a source of tension and more a kind of orientation, like knowing which direction is north, useful without being consuming. He danced with Mrs. Pontefract's eldest daughter, who was 17 and incandescent with terror. He managed it with great kindness, which Sylvie observed from across the room and filed without comment. She danced with Arthur and with Colonel Festing, who danced badly but with enormous conviction. She did not dance with Dominic. They both knew, without discussion, that was not yet the right gesture in a county that was watching. Late in the evening, the room warm now, the candles lower, the company loosened by dancing and a bowl of punch, she found herself near the back wall with a glass she was not drinking, and Dominic beside her, also not drinking. "You were very kind to Miss Pontefract," she said. She was terrified. She was, but you noticed, which not everyone would. "I am not entirely without observation." A pause. She reminded me of my youngest sister at that age. "You have sisters?" "Two, both married now. Charlotte in Derbyshire, Eliza in Hampshire. Charlotte wrote to me in October." He stopped, smiled briefly. "She said I was an idiot and deserved everything I had and was likely getting." Sylvie turned to look at him. "She sounds remarkable." "She is forthright." "Forthright is remarkable. In my experience, it is also rare." "She will be pleased to hear that." He looked at the room. "I should like you to meet her when, if that becomes possible." "Charlotte, who says you are an idiot?" "The very same." "I think I should like to meet her very much." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and the room continued its ordinary noise around them, the music beginning again, Arthur making someone laugh across the hall, the punch bowl being quietly restocked. "Sylvie," he said. The name, not the form of address. Her name as he had used it when they were engaged, with the soft opening of it that his particular voice gave it. She felt it. She let herself feel it, which was its own kind of progress. "Not yet," she said, quietly, not unkindly. "No," he said, "I know." They stood side by side, not quite touching, watching Arthur demonstrate to a young gentleman the correct way to hold a punch cup, which was wrong in every particular. "Your cousin," Dominic said, "is a very good person." "He is, rather." "He said, at Thursday before I left, he said you were the best person he knew." A pause. "I thought you should know that someone has said it plainly, since no one else seems to." She looked at the floor, at the candles, at nothing in particular. "He is 20 years old," she said. "Yes, and quite right." She said nothing. He did not press it. The music played and the room danced and the January night pressed against the windows, and she was, in spite of everything, glad to be exactly where she was. The letter on Sylvie's writing desk on the morning of the 3rd of February was not from Dominic. It was from Edmund. This was unusual. Edmund communicated about household matters through the ordinary channels of a well-run house, a word at the Monday accounts, a note on the household board, an item mentioned in passing. He had never, in 8 months, written her a letter of his own composition. It was 1 page, the handwriting was very good. "Dear Miss Calder, I am writing rather than speaking to you about the following matter, because I believe it is better managed in writing, and because I am aware that what I am about to say is strictly beyond my position. I ask you to receive it in the spirit in which it is intended, which is one of genuine concern for your situation and not impertinence. I have observed over the past month that the visits from the Duke of Calmore have produced in you a quality of attention that the preceding weeks did not. I do not say this to draw conclusions. I am not in the business of drawing conclusions about things that are not my business. I say it because I believe you may be preventing yourself from acting on something you have already decided, on the grounds that it is too soon or too uncertain, and because in my experience, which is extensive, if not in this precise variety of situation, the distance between what one has decided and what one allows oneself to do is where most of the unhappiness lives. I am also writing to tell you that His Grace inquired of me, this past Tuesday when he called, and you were briefly out of the room, whether there was anything about your circumstances or your happiness that I thought he should be aware of. I told him that you were very well. This was true. I did not tell him that very well, and entirely content are not the same thing, because that was not my information to give. I remain, as always, your servant in whatever capacity is useful. Edmund Crale. P.S. There is also a letter from His Grace on the tray which I have not opened, in the event that you would like to read it before responding to this one. She sat for a considerable time at her writing desk with this letter in her hands. Then she set it down and picked up Dominic's letter from the tray. It was also unusual, not in form but in what it contained, which was not an arrangement for a visit or a report on the Valencourt correspondence, but a single question written with the brevity of a man who has spent several drafts arriving at one sentence. I would like to know whether what is happening between us is something you wish to continue, or whether I am mistaking patience for permission. I ask directly, because I find I cannot ask indirectly anymore. She read it twice. She looked at the window. She picked up her pen. Your Grace, it is not Patience I would like you to call on Thursday. Yours, Sylvie. She gave it to Edmund at the door of the library, where he was cataloguing the damp corner books for replacement. He received it without expression. The post, he said. The post, and Edmund. He looked up. Your letter was not impertinent. He looked at the letter in his hand. I'm glad to hear it. It was, however, very precisely right, which is almost worse. I will endeavour to be less precise in future. You will do nothing of the kind, she said, and went back to the sitting room. Thursday, as Thursdays had learned to be, was better than expected. He arrived at 11. Edmund took his coat. He came into the sitting room. The fire was burning. The window was behind her. The seed cake was on the table, because Mrs. Fenn had long since stopped treating its presence as contingent on instruction. Mrs. Fenn herself moved in the passage outside, with the quiet attentiveness she had established as her custom on these mornings. They sat. For the first 10 minutes the conversation was ordinary. The roads which had improved, a letter from Charlotte which had made him laugh, whether Arthur had returned to Oxford, which he had reluctantly the previous week, leaving behind a Copernicus-shaped absence that the house had not yet adjusted to. Then Sylvie said, I've been thinking about what you wrote. I imagined you might. You asked whether you were mistaking patience for permission. I did. The answer is, she paused, the answer is that I was not being patient, I was being frightened. He looked at her steadily. He did not interrupt. I was frightened, she said, that if I moved toward you again I would find the same man who made the same demand. And I know you are not. I have seen enough to know you are not. But knowing something and allowing yourself to act on it are... She stopped. Edmund wrote to me about the distance between what one has decided and what one allows oneself to do. Dominic blinked. Crale wrote to you? He did, a letter, 1 page, very precise. A pause. Was it useful? Infuriatingly so. He looked at the door where Edmund was not visible, and making himself very present through his absence. Right, he said, to nobody. She looked at her hands, then at him. I have decided, she said. I should like you to know that. I have decided and I am telling you, which is the part I was avoiding. He leaned forward slightly, not toward her physically, but toward the conversation. What have you decided? That I do not want to go on like this. Visits and letters and seed cake and everything very carefully managed. She met his eyes. I want to know if you are the same person who wrote me letters in Lyon. Not the man who made the demand. The man who wrote to my uncle, who learned French, who burned the returned letter rather than... She stopped. Edmund told me. About the letter. The one returned unread. Dominic was very still. He told you that? Yes. I did not ask him to. I know. He told me because he thought I should have accurate information. She held his gaze. Were you going to tell me? A long pause. Eventually, he said, when it did not seem as though I was using it. That is, she looked at the window, that is exactly the right reason. He was quiet. I am not patient, she said. I would like you to know that about me. I have been patient for 8 months because I was hurt, and I was building something of my own, and I needed the time. I am not naturally patient. I am my mother's daughter, and she was not patient either. She was precise, which people confused for patience, but it is not the same thing. No, he said, it is not. And I am done being careful. He stood. She stood because it was that kind of moment, the kind where remaining seated is itself a choice. He crossed the small room in 2 steps. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the particular quality of attention in his face that she had been cataloguing for 2 months without admitting she was cataloguing it. Sylvie, he said. Yes, she said. It was not an answer to a question he had asked. He put his hand along her jaw very carefully, and she turned her face toward it, which was the whole of the permission required, and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who has been waiting longer than he should have had to, and knows it. She kissed him back with the same acknowledgement. The window light was behind her. The fire was beside them. The room was very quiet. When they separated, neither of them moved far. He kept his hand where it was, and she let him, and they stood there in the small sitting room at Calder Heath, with the lane outside, and the frost and the seed cake going cold on the table, and she started to laugh. He looked at her, startled. "The seed cake," she said. He glanced at it. He started to laugh too. "Mrs. Fenn," he said, "she will be devastated. We could eat it now. We absolutely should eat it now." They ate the seed cake. They stood at the window together while they ate it. The first time she had stood at that window with someone else. The first time she had wanted to. And the lane was exactly itself. The same lane it had always been, and it looked entirely different. Edmund knew when the Duke left, from the fact that he left at 2:30, which was 4 hours after he had arrived, and that was all the information required. He said nothing about it. He brought Sylvie tea at 3. She was at the writing desk. She looked like a woman who had been sitting there for a while without writing anything. "Should I write to him?" she said. "He left 90 minutes ago," Edmund said. "Yes. By the time a letter reaches Calmore Park, he will be home. That is not a reason not to write." "No," Edmund agreed, "it isn't." She picked up the pen, put it down. "He is coming Sunday," she said. "So he said." "Did he seem—" She stopped. "When you handed him his coat, did he seem—" Edmund considered this with the gravity it deserved. "He tipped his hat," he said. "At the house, not at me specifically, at the house." She turned to look at him. "He tipped his hat." "As he drove away at the house." "That is either charming or alarming," she said. "I believe," Edmund said, "that most things about him are both from your particular vantage point." "Go away," she said, but she was smiling. "Going," he said. He went, she wrote. Sunday came, then the following Thursday, then the Sunday after that. The visits were no longer visits in the formal sense. They were afternoons, long and careless with time, sprawling past the hour that was appropriate and into the hour that was simply true. She showed him the house properly, the library, her father's study, the east bedroom that had been unoccupied since the chimney was repaired. He stood in the doorway of her father's study for a moment. "Did you know him well, your father?" "Very well, and not quite enough. He died before I had finished understanding him." What was left to understand? She thought about it. Why he was happy. He was content in a way I could see but not account for. My mother was gone. The diplomatic career was over. He was here in this house in Wiltshire with nothing he had originally planned for himself. And he was. He was content. In a way I wanted to understand and now have to figure out for myself. Dominic looked at the room. "I think it may be one of those things that only make sense from inside it. Contentment is not something one can observe into understanding. One arrives at it another way." She looked at him. "That is either very wise or a thing you're saying to me with a specific intention." "Both," he said without the smallest embarrassment. She smiled. "Come away from the doorway," she said. "Edmund has been waiting to show you the South Field drainage report for 3 weeks, and if we do not go and look at the field today, he will put it at the top of his list." "It is already at the top of his list." "How do you know?" "Because I have known Crale long enough to understand that anything unattended to is, in his mind, at the top of a list, until it is done." "That," she said, "is the most accurate thing anyone has said about him." They went and looked at the Southfield drainage, with Edmund and his report and the practical conversation that practical things required. And it was, as many afternoons at Calder Heath had come to be, exactly ordinary and exactly right. He proposed on the 14th of February, which was almost too convenient to be accidental, and which, when she pointed this out, he admitted was not accidental. "I could have proposed last week," he said, "but it would have seemed less." "You are incurably sentimental," she said. "I prefer to think of it as deliberate." "You are incurably sentimental, and prefer to think of it as deliberate." They were in the sitting room. The window was behind her, the fire beside them, the lane outside exactly as it always had been. He did not go down on one knee. He had done that the first time, formally, in a London drawing-room, in front of her father, which had been the correct procedure and had been deeply correct and entirely without character. This time he stood in front of her and took both her hands and said, "I would like to marry you, not as I would have had you before, in my house, in my world, under my arrangements. I would like to marry you as you are. French and English and precise and impatient, and the most maddening person I have ever attempted to be honest with." She looked at him. You have been practicing that?
For 3 weeks.
How many drafts? A slight pause. Several. I worked through them on my own here and at Calmore. The final version I had from memory by the time I needed it. She looked at her hands in his. She looked at the window, the lane, the February morning, the hedges just beginning to think about spring. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. Edmund drove to the Marlborough post office on the 15th of February with 3 letters, which was one more than usual, and the particular efficiency of a man whose arrangements are proceeding as expected. The first letter was to Uncle Philippe Valancourt in Lyon. Sylvie had written it in French, which she spoke better than she wrote, and Edmund had reviewed the spelling without comment. It was 2 pages, the longest letter she had written since arriving in England, and contained between its lines everything a mother's brother needed to know about his niece's happiness. The second letter was to Charlotte in Derbyshire. Dominic had written it. It was 3 sentences. The third letter was from Edmund to Remy, his successor in the Valancourt household, and was entirely personal and none of anyone else's business. He returned to Calder Heath at noon. Sylvie was in the sitting room at the writing desk, which was now actually being used for writing. She looked up. "Posted," he said. "All 3? "All 3. She nodded, looked at the window, then, without turning, "Edmund, what will you do when I am at Calmore?" A pause. "That depends on what you require of me." "I'm asking what you want." Another pause, longer. "I am accustomed," he said carefully, "to wanting what is useful." She turned from the desk to look at him. "I know I'm asking what you want when usefulness is not the constraint." He looked at the window, at the lane, visible behind her. "I would like," he said at last, "to continue in your household, at Calmore or otherwise. I find the work congenial." "The work?" "The work and—" he stopped. "The household." She held his gaze. "You will come to Calmore," she said. "You are mine technically. The Duke has learned not to quibble about technicalities." "I believe he has." "And Edmund—" "Miss Calder, you are not simply useful to me. You are—" she chose the words carefully. "You fix things, not just chimneys and window frames. You fix things that needed to be fixed, and I am not certain they would have been fixed without you." He looked at the candlestick on the mantel. He straightened it, which did not need straightening. "The chimneys would have managed," he said. "Not the chimneys," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face, which she had been reading for 8 months, was less composed than usual. "So you are welcome," he said at last, which was not quite an answer to what she had said and was also exactly right. "Uncle Philippe arrived in England in March. He came with his manservant, his portmanteau, his gout, his botanical correspondence, and the comprehensive critical faculty of a man who has agreed to approve something and intends to do so rigorously. He arrived at Calder Heath first. He walked through the house. He stood at the sitting-room window. He looked at the lane. He said in French, 'Your mother would have liked this room.'" "She would," Sylvie said. "The window is good. A person can see what is coming." "Yes." He looked at her. He had her mother's eyes, which was something Sylvie found she could look at directly now, which she had not been able to do in the first months after Genevieve died. "You are happy," he said. An observation, not a question. "I am going to be," she said. "I think that is more interesting than already being." He considered this. "Your mother said something similar. When she married your father, she said she was going to be happy and intended to do it thoroughly. Was she right?" "Absolutely," he said, "thoroughly." He met Dominic the following day at Calmore Park, which Philippe toured with the expression of a man pricing real estate and the manner of a man enjoying architecture. Dominic received him with the care of someone who has been told what matters and has taken notes. He spoke to Philippe in French. Not fluently. The French was careful, limited, frequently assisted by Edmund, who had been brought along in the capacity of household manager and was operating at something closer to diplomatic interpreter. But the effort was present. The grammar in the second paragraph was occasionally correct. Philippe, who had spent 43 years observing people for a living, watched the Duke of Calmore conjugate an apology in imperfect French to the wrong tense, be gently corrected by his future wife's household manager, and accept the correction without embarrassment. He said in English to Edmund on the way back through the garden, "He is not what I expected." "No," Edmund said, "he rarely is." "You were in his household." "For 6 months." Philippe looked at him sideways. "And you chose to leave?" "I chose to enter Miss Calder's service," Edmund said. "The 2 things are related but not the same." Philippe considered this. You are very careful with language. It is a professional habit. It is also a personal one. Philippe stopped at the gate. He looked back at the house where Dominic and Sylvie were visible through the drawing-room window, standing close, not quite touching, the ordinary proximity of two people who have been careful for a long time and are beginning to stop. She trusts you, Philippe said.
Yes.
That is not nothing from a Valancourt. He resumed walking. I shall tell her Uncle Auguste that he was wrong. He was certain the English would make her grey. And you? I was certain she would make the English interesting, Philippe said. I was right. They married in April, at the church in the village, 12 miles from Calder Heath and 4 miles from Calmore Park, equidistant from both and therefore nobody's entirely, which was, Sylvie said, exactly right. The church was small. The congregation was not large. Charlotte from Derbyshire, who was exactly as forthright as advertised and embraced Sylvie within 30 seconds of meeting her. Eliza from Hampshire, quieter, who watched everything with the same quality of attention her brother had. Arthur in a new coat that was very slightly too fashionable for Wiltshire. Dorothea in the front pew, with the vindicated satisfaction of a woman whose arrangements had worked. Colonel Festing, who cried, which nobody had predicted. Mrs. Fenn and Mrs. Pontefract and Sir Edward Vine, who had arranged the dinner at which they had first encountered each other again after the breaking of the engagement, and who received Sylvie's calm acknowledgment of this with the relief of a man whose interference had worked out. Uncle Philippe stood for the Valancourts. Edmund stood where he ought to be. The rector, who had shaken Sylvie's hand with both of his on the Sunday she returned, and told her he was very glad to have her back, conducted the service with the straightforward warmth of a man who knows a parish well enough to understand what a marriage in it means. Dominic took her hand at the appropriate moment. He said what he had to say without looking at any paper. She said what she had to say without having written it down at all. The rector pronounced them married. Charlotte said something to Eliza in a whisper that made Eliza cover a smile. Arthur, who had been trying to appear sophisticated since they entered the church, gave up entirely and grinned at nothing in particular. Afterwards, in the church porch, in April light, thin and clean and just beginning to mean it, Dominic said quietly, while the congregation milled around them, I tipped my hat at your house. I know, she said. Edmund told me. He looked at Edmund, who was managing the carriage arrangements with Mrs. Fenn and absorbing himself completely in the task. He tells you a great many things, Dominic said. He tells me the right things, she said, at the right time. I know. He took her hand. I'm glad he does. They went to Calmore Park. It was larger than Calder Heath, which had been its recommendation in Dominic's original calculations about the engagement, and was now simply a fact, a large house that was warm, better staffed, and had very good windows, all of which faced different aspects and had different qualities of light. But Sylvie kept the sitting room at Calder Heath. The house was maintained, lived in periodically, visited. The window with the slightly bowed frame on the left side where the water had got in, which the Marlborough glazier had scheduled and rescheduled, and which had now been bowed long enough to be architectural rather than a defect, remained exactly as it was. It was her mother's room, it was her room. She was going to be happy in it. Their daughter arrived in January 1826, 2 years after the assembly in the village hall, where they had stood side by side, not quite touching, and watched Arthur instruct someone incorrectly in the management of a punch cup. They named her Geneviève. Uncle Philippe, informed by letter, replied within 4 days, the fastest letter Sylvie had ever received from Lyon, and the third paragraph in French she read 3 times before she could read it without her eyes doing something inconvenient. Geneviève was fair, loud, and immediately clear about her opinions, which Charlotte called prophetic, and Dominic called inevitable, and Edmund asked his view, called a promising development, which was the most enthusiastic endorsement available in that particular vocabulary. Their son arrived in the spring of 1828. They named him Thomas, which was Sylvie's father's name, and Philippe, which was the second name, and Arthur at the end because Arthur had been there and had walked the dog for 3 hours every Thursday for 6 weeks and deserved something for it. Thomas Philippe Arthur was a placid child who regarded the world with interest and no urgency, which his father said was nothing like him, and his mother said was everything like him, and which Edmund, setting a cup of tea on the table in the sitting room at Calmore where Sylvie was nursing him, said was perhaps a question best left open. You have an opinion, Sylvie said. I have observed that he watches things carefully before he acts on them. Edmund said. "I consider that a quality worth having." "Like his father now," she said, "not as he was." "People change," Edmund said, "when the right person requires it of them." She looked up. He was looking at the window, the tall one at Calmore that faced the garden, which in spring was beginning to mean it, the kitchen garden first, and then the beds that Dominic had replanted when she mentioned, in passing, that her uncle's garden in Lyon had yellow borders in April. There were yellow borders. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her. "When Thomas is old enough to ask you about things, and he will ask you about things, you are the kind of person children ask about things." "Mrs. Calmore." "When he asks," she said, "tell him the honest version, not the flattering one." "What is the honest version?" She looked at the window, the garden, the yellow borders, the spring light coming through glass that was clear and properly set and not bowed at all. "That his mother and father were not very good at talking to each other," she said, "and that someone who was better at it helped them get there. And that this is not a small thing." She looked at Edmund. "It is not a small thing." He straightened. He did not straighten a candlestick. He simply stood. "No," he said, "it is not." Dominic came in from the garden with Genevieve on his shoulders and mud on his coat, and the expression of a man who has been outside for 2 hours conducting a detailed botanical survey of his own flower beds, as explained by a child of 2. He stopped in the doorway. "She says the yellow ones are called Soleil," he said to Sylvie. "They are called Soleil," I told her. "And the others?" "The blue ones are Ciel and the white ones are Neige." He looked at his daughter. "We are raising her to speak both languages. We are raising her correctly." He smiled, the smile his face had learned to find more easily in the past 4 years, and set Genevieve down. She ran immediately to Edmund and was received without fuss and lifted, at her request, to see out the tall window into the garden she had just come from. "The yellow ones," she told Edmund, very seriously pointing. "I see them," Edmund said. "Soleil," she said. "Soleil," he agreed. Sylvie watched them. Dominic crossed the room and sat beside her and looked at Thomas, who was asleep against her with the completeness only very small people manage. "All right," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "entirely." He put his hand over hers. She turned hers to meet it. At the window, Genevieve was explaining the garden to Edmund in a mixture of French and English that obeyed the grammar of neither and required no translation. Outside, the yellow borders were doing what yellow borders do in April, which is be unreasonably cheerful about the whole business of existing. The room held the light held the room, and everything was, against most reasonable prediction and several months of circumstantial difficulty, exactly as it should be.